Mina damer och herrar, jag är glad att få vara här idag. Tack för inbjudan. Silicon Valley, my hometown, is the most prolific high technology center in the world. On a per capita basis, Stockholm is number 2. What can Silicon Valley and Stockholm learn from each other? For the last 38 years, I've lived and worked in Silicon Valley, home to Apple, Google, Facebook, HP, Intel, Genentech, Salesforce, Twitter, Yelp, and many others. In these 38 years, I've worked for large and small companies alike, some of which have gone out of business, and founded, grown, and sold 2 software companies, co-founded a third, and invested in others. I think there is a great deal we can learn from each other. Sweden is home of Spotify, Skype, king of Candy Crush fame, Mojang of Minecraft fame, the payment services Klarna, and many others. The population of Sweden is less than 10 million, about the same as New York City. So you think globally from the outset, something we need to do more of. I see a greater inclination for entrepreneurs and people in general to live more frugally in Sweden than in the United States, which provides a key source of funds for startups in the earliest stages. And the culture of incubators and accelerators, whereby startups can learn from each other, is well established here. Entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley, and I believe in Sweden as well, has arisen organically. In the case of Silicon Valley, over 8 decades. Silicon Valley was not designed or planned, nor could it have been. No one could predict that thousands of mobile app developers would arise for mobile devices, which in turn would arise from cell phones and popular 1990s handhelds like the Palm Pilot, which would evolve alongside the World Wide Web, laptops, and pagers, which would arise from local area networking in parallel with gene sequencing, and more. All of the seeds and soil that gave rise to mobile apps existed in the 1980s, yet no one predicted or could have predicted them. Even as late as 2003, no one could have predicted or did predict the incredible rise of Facebook, which was founded in 2004. I dare say the same was true of Skype and Spotify. Unpredictability is not specific to Silicon Valley and Stockholm. It is a feature of all innovation. The Santa Fe Institute in Santa Fe, New Mexico is a world-leading research center that focuses on complex systems. Economies, the environment, the human brain, innovation, and common law are all examples of complex systems, meaning that order arises not by top-down design, but from the interactions of many agents, whether individuals, neurons, or companies. Negligible differences in initial conditions can give rise to large differences in outcomes, and if you try to control such systems, you get unintended consequences. So don't try to predict them and don't try to control them. Both Silicon Valley and Stockholm have multinationals, of course, but more importantly are the thousands of locally grown companies, large and small, which together form interconnected ecosystems. The U.S. has 2 top high-tech areas, Silicon Valley and Route 128 around Boston. In the 1980s, Silicon Valley overtook Route 128, which got started decades before Silicon Valley. Why? Silicon Valley has 2 world-class universities, Stanford and Berkeley, as does Boston, Harvard, and MIT. But while Route 128 was mainly populated with vertically integrated centralized companies like Digital, Honeywell, Wang, and Prime, computer companies that made everything from disk drives to CPUs, Silicon Valley companies were much more atomic. Silicon Valley had many separate companies making disk drives and terminals and operating software and microprocessors and disk controllers. So the competition and spontaneous order were more direct, more granular, and more intense. If an entrepreneur saw a need for a better disk controller or today a better mobile payment system, he or she could assemble a team to build and test a solution to satisfy that need. Boston's computer industry has long disappeared. Those centralized companies could not adapt when technology shifted from minis to desktops to PCs to laptops to mobile devices. In contrast, the more decentralized ecosystem in Silicon Valley was more resilient and could more readily adapt as market conditions change. If the vertically integrated computer companies of Route 128 could not survive, imagine how much less resilient government-authorized monopolies like railroads, postal services, and public utilities are. Insulated from market forces, such monopolies have no incentive to be innovative, cost-effective, or customer service-oriented. Hundreds of thousands of companies have been started in Silicon Valley over the decades. Most of them failed. Growth comes from the companies that survive and grow. These are a small minority of all the companies that are founded. It is not enough to have a few well-established anchor tenants to make an ecosystem. For a robust ecosystem, you need thousands of companies starting up, most of which will fail, and a few of which will succeed and grow large. So we've seen that 1, you cannot predict the winners in advance, and 2, you need a lot of startups, most of which will fail. So don't expect an arm of Sweden or the EU government in particular to choose winners. Even highly rewarded and experienced venture capitalists get only 1 or 2 investments out of 10 right. Especially with many political forces that lead them astray, governments cannot choose winners or losers. A notable example in the US is Solyndra, the solar energy company. Before Solyndra declared bankruptcy in 2011, the U.S. Department of Energy and State of California together provided over $500 million of loans, none of which was recovered. Governments cannot even predict winning or losing technologies, much less specific products and services. As I wrote in Forbes 3 years ago, in 2010, the U.S. Joint Forces Command warned that, quote, by 2012, surplus oil production capacity could entirely disappear, unquote. Somehow, they missed the fracking revolution, which would hugely expand U.S. oil and gas production just 2 years later. Similarly, in 2011, the U.S. Federal Communications Commission and AT&T saw a looming crisis. Wireless was running out of spectrum. Somehow, they missed Wi-Fi, which would bypass and preserve the precious wireless spectrum, completely eliminating the crisis. Many trials, whether successes or failures, are also key to learning and ultimately to success in Silicon Valley. Each attempt is a learning experiment for the entrepreneur. If you don't try to satisfy what you think is a customer need, you never discover where real customer needs lie. As a result, having 1 or more failures before you first succeed is very likely. Having worked for at least 1 failed startup is so common, it's just no big deal. Here's a question and a challenge for Sweden. How might the same mindset and culture be widely adopted here and more generally in Europe? So that is the benefit of failures. Regarding successes, everyone has heard of the huge IPOs like Google and Facebook, but for every very visible liquidity event like those are hundreds of much smaller liquidity events. Together, the few large liquidity events, which might benefit hundreds of employees, and the many smaller liquidity events, which each might benefit a single founder or handful of co-founders, spread wealth very broadly across the region. Silicon Valley is the ultimate anti-poverty program. Such events have further given rise to both major venture capital firms and tens of thousands of smaller scale angel investors, all of whom help launch the next cohort of startups and complete the positive feedback loop. My sense is that Stockholm is just beginning to enjoy this virtuous cycle. So those are factors that contribute to Silicon Valley and Stockholm's entrepreneurial successes. In my experience, the biggest obstacle to entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley, and I suspect in Stockholm as well, is regulation. In most respects, starting a company today is easier than it has been in the past, thanks to technology. Software has become more functional and smarter. Many services and technical courses are available free online. Just one thing has made starting a business harder, and that's government regulation. One small example. Over half of U.S. states now require a license to braid hair. In some cases, braiders, many of them young black women who can ill afford the expense, must take irrelevant courses costing thousands of dollars. Many potential entrepreneurs, especially those with few skills and resources, are being blocked, and the numbers blocked are growing each decade. They block the very men and women in society who find it hardest to find work and provide for their families in self-sufficient dignity. Still, other regulations disallow life-saving drugs. Such regulations do not improve quality of life. They generate revenue for governments and protect politically important lobbies from competition. Let's see graphically the effects of imposed regulations. Say that 10 years ago, in some aspect of your life, perhaps your personal health or the airspace above and around your home, what you were allowed to do by law was bounded by these new regulations. Now fast forward 10 years to the present. Regulations stay fixed while advances in knowledge, technology, and cooperation enable more dimensions of human needs to be satisfied that the regulations also preclude. During that time, perhaps, innovation has enabled intelligent drones, or Uber and Lyft crowdsourced taxi services, or neurogaming helmets with sensors that detect your emotional state and incorporate it into gameplay. What had previously been a single dimension of possibilities excluded by regulation is now many dimensions of human needs whose satisfaction is disallowed by those same regulations. But these figures oversimplify the situation. The actual situation is far worse. The regulations are not clear, flat boundaries between what is allowed and disallowed, but irregular and complex surfaces. The longer, more complex and subjective the regulation, the more irregular, complex, and blurry the surfaces. These surfaces take more time and money to explore and comprehend, and impart more advantage to the well-funded and well-connected. Creating ever more complex laws to block loopholes is not the solution. That only further advantages the well-funded, connected, and influential who can afford the best legal counsel and win exemptions. The only sustainable solution is fewer, simpler, and less obtrusive laws. Yeah.
You only have a couple of minutes left.
Okay. All right, great. I'm almost done. Over 100,000 health and fitness apps compete today, but relative devices. Why? Because these areas are more regulated. And if even a fraction of those companies and entrepreneurs could address the opportunities in these other areas, these other fields and humanity would see much more faster advance today. The easy, popular, and ineffective way to deal with this is through such techniques as business plan competitions and elevator pitch competitions and immediate short-term incentives. I call these entrepreneurship theater. Instead, we have to address the real problem, which is making tax environments more attractive than anywhere else in the world so that entrepreneurs want to come here rather than elsewhere, and making regulation as light as possible. And in the book I offer, the problem is difficult because the most egregious regulations vary from region to region and from industry to industry. So there is no single silver bullet. And there are just a lot of things that we need to work on in parallel, and the book offers a bunch of these. To give, I'll skip that one. To give full credit to Sweden. Sweden is number 8 on the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index, only one spot below the United States. But any of us can improve. And here we see that Sweden was number 9 last year, is number 8 this year. That's good. Sweden has moved up. These are the areas that contribute to that, and the areas in which Sweden can potentially improve. Here's an aggressive goal. In 5 years, make it a goal to cut Sweden's rank in half from 8 to 4. In summary, to further advance entrepreneurial ecosystems in Sweden and the EU, recognize that they cannot be designed and that the winners and losers cannot be predicted, especially by governments. Focus instead on creating the right climate and environment, attractive taxes and unobtrusive regulation, trust in freedom and free markets. Nothing less than freedom and the continued flourishing of Sweden and the EU is at stake. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those kind words. Rosine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Frederick. Well, first let me say it's a pleasure to be back here after a few years at Timbro. I think the first time I came here was 14 years ago, and of course ESIPE was through Frederick Eriksson was an outgrowth of Timbro. And it's nice to be surrounded by lots of Nordic design again. Well, I have some pretty brief observations to make on the two keywords of this panel, which are jobs and entrepreneurship. And I want to talk about jobs and entrepreneurship in Europe by reference to Asia and what lessons there are from Asia or parts of Asia for Europe. Let me explain why I do this in a roundabout way. I left Europe about 5 years ago and moved to Singapore. So I spent most of my time in Asia, in Singapore and in my native Sri Lanka. I don't look Sri Lankan. I may sound more British than anything else to you, but I happen to be half Sri Lankan. So my acquaintance with the world of policies and regulation is much more Asia than Europe these days. So I will look at jobs and entrepreneurship through an Asian mirror. Jobs and entrepreneurship are two different but related things. So by the jobs agenda, I'm thinking of employment creation generally, whatever jobs are created, whether they're unskilled, low-skilled, mid-skilled, or high-skilled. Entrepreneurship, Deirdre and John have talked a lot about. I don't want to go into that, but to begin with, I look at entrepreneurship very much in a Schumpeterian sense. It is about the agent, the entrepreneur, who innovates. So I will, if you'll excuse me, just use the word innovation for a while. And by that, Schumpeter meant, very simply, taking new ideas and bringing them to market by doing new and different things through a process of creative destruction. So it's very much about the enabling environment for that kind of entrepreneurship to take place. And of course, that kind of entrepreneurship produces better skilled, higher paying, more stimulating jobs than just any old job. That's the difference between jobs per se and entrepreneurship for jobs. Now, my starting point is that Europe is clearly doing badly and worse on both fronts, on the jobs front as well as on the entrepreneurship front. Now, of course, Europe is big and varied. There are some pockets of Europe that are doing relatively better. So that's true of Britain and other parts of Northwestern and North Europe, and one can think of the Baltics in Eastern Europe. But then most of the rest of Europe is much worse, particularly the large countries in the south and some in the east as well, where you do have not just high unemployment, but particularly high youth unemployment. And most of Europe, in fact, is stuck or stagnant when it comes to entrepreneurship in the sense that I've defined it or explained it simply. Particularly if you compare it with the United States. Now, the real problem in Europe is low productivity and little innovation in the services sector in particular. And we are talking of countries that, as economists would put it, are somewhere close to the frontier, as it were. These are rich, mature economies. They need productivity growth because they can't mobilize inputs like labor and capital just to engineer fast catch-up growth. And that productivity growth is supposed to come through innovation. Well, services continue to be innovated by entrepreneurial companies in the United States. And breakthrough services, breakthrough companies, Facebook, Google, and so on, not accidentally, come from the United States because you have a much more entrepreneurial economy for that kind of innovation and wealth creation. A classic example I give to my students is that of Nokia. Nokia, of course, was one of the big European success stories in manufacturing. But Nokia remained a manufacturing company. It never developed a services ecosystem around it the way Apple did in the United States. And that is a reflection of the European economy that Nokia was and is embedded in. So what lessons from Asia for Europe? Well, Asia is an ancient Greek construct. It's everything to the east of ancient Greece, putting Europe and Africa to one side. Okay? So it is large, it's very difficult to generalize, of course. The Asia that I'm familiar with is not so much Central Asia or North Asia or the Middle East. It's more globalizing Asia, which is East Asia and South Asia. So it's from India and the rest of South Asia through the middle of Southeast Asia, the ASEAN countries, to Greater China and Northeast Asia, and you could add Australia and New Zealand going further down. These are 4 different types of economies. You have rich Asia, which is the Northeast Asian pocket, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, plus the city-states of Hong Kong and Singapore. You have middle-income Asia, which is 3 countries, China now, astonishingly so, given where it started, plus Malaysia and Thailand, per capita incomes of between $8,000 to $15,000 a year. Then you have low middle-income Asia, which is a populous bulk, including India, Indonesia, Philippines and Vietnam, and my own Sri Lanka. And then you have really poor Asia, actually not that populous these days, countries like Nepal, Cambodia, Laos, East Timor. Now, back to jobs. There are good examples and there are really bad examples. So let me give you some really bad examples, which are obviously examples to avoid. Think of India, not just under the license Raj, but India today. And here we're talking of a low middle-income country. India has something on the statute books called the Industrial Disputes Act, which goes back to 1947. In other words, it actually started under the British. And then Mrs. Gandhi ratcheted it up with one provision, which is still on the statute books. If you are a company that employs 100 or more people, you have to apply for permission to the Labor Department of your state government to fire even one person. Right. There's an infamous example of someone from Bharat Forge, which is belongs to one of the big Indian kind of business houses, who was dismissed for sleeping on the job, quite literally, in 1984. The company actually managed to get rid of him about 3 or 4 years ago. In other words, he continued to sleep on the job for an extra 20 plus years. Now, what's the effect of that kind of regulation? It's prevented India from having an East Asian style industrial revolution because companies either remain very small, cottage industries, Or, some of the big ones, employ capital and technology, but not unskilled labor from the countryside and put them into work in jobs in the cities. So which is why India hasn't had the kind of growth and prosperity that China has had. 90%, more than 90%, it's close to 95% of Indians who work in the so-called informal or unorganized economy. In other words, they have no legal protections. They're stuck in low wages, low productivity jobs. Right. That's the effect of this kind of regulation. Now, the better examples come from East Asia. The East Asian miracle, the catch-up growth of the East Asian tigers ending with China, is due to many things about getting the basics right. But one of those getting the basics right was to have flexible labor markets. Yes, in some cases, unions were forcibly suppressed, as in South Korea. But flexible labor markets means you're open to both entry and exit. Right? Without that, they wouldn't have had catch-up growth. Right? So the lesson there, I think, is very simple. You need labor markets with ease of entry and exit. And another thing from the East Asian miracle economies, they maintained, and still maintain more or less, reasonably small welfare states, where you do target the really needy, but you don't create middle-class entitlements. Right. Now, the best examples come from the city-states of Hong Kong and Singapore. I live in Singapore, so let me give you the Singaporean example here. You have very flexible labor markets. Employers, local and foreign, are able to hire and fire. And that combined with a welfare state that it exists, but it's very basic and it's very well targeted, creates the incentives for productive work. And I think Singapore offers very good an example of labor market regulation, welfare state regulation, that I think should be studied a lot more over here. Another thing about Singapore, the welfare state in Singapore, well, let me put it another way. The provision of things like pensions, healthcare, unemployment insurance is funded in Singapore. It's almost fully funded because it comes from private accounts. So you don't have that kind of build-up of a stock of unfunded debt that you have in Europe. Let me now end with the entrepreneurship issue. Here, the lessons are not from Asia, because most countries in Asia have the kind of institutions that were congruent with catch-up growth. Catch-up growth you can do under different political systems, even with a lot of corruption, providing the corruption is reasonably predictable, right? And the price isn't too high. But the rich economies of Asia and the middle-income economies in Asia are stuck because they haven't actually moved from perspiration to inspiration, to quote Paul Krugman. They haven't moved to...
Edison.
And Paul Krugman borrowed...
He borrowed it.
From Edison.
As he borrows everything.
Okay. So we have institutions in Asia that simply haven't adapted or transformed themselves to nurture this kind of innovation-led growth. Why? Because political systems remain closed, highly illiberal. Because societies remain closed or semi-closed. They haven't become open societies in the full plural sense. And because regulation stifles not just products but factor markets. This is crucial. Unless you liberate not just the product markets, but the markets for factors, for labor, land, and capital, you're not going to have a truly innovative society. This is the real challenge in Asia. And the politics or the political economy of liberalizing your banking system, property rights in the countryside, and even your labor markets, that's a bigger challenge than simply liberalizing products. So when it comes to entrepreneurship, I don't think Europe has much to learn from Asia in the round. And the lesson here, I think, is very clear. To move from imitation to innovation, to real entrepreneurship, that kind of creative destruction, you need a combination of plural open societies, liberal institutions, which, yes, does mean democracy. Right? I don't think there's any way around that when you get to a mature stage. And then finally, regulatory reforms that go beyond the initial phase of liberalizing products to liberalizing factors, land, labor, and capital. Thank you.
Deirdre, do you want to rejoin the panel?
Certainly.
Do any of the speakers, commentators, have any comments on each other?
Well, I just say that my colleagues are extremely insightful and correct because they agree with me. Pretty much. So let's move to the
Okay, the audience.
They have more interesting things to ask.
Questions? Wait for the mic, please, and please state your name and any affiliation.
Thank you. I'm Fabian Widman. I just want to know, how do you foresee the future of robotics? Thank you.
Of what?
Robotics.
We mustn't be frightened by the word. It's
Workforce.
what?
Workforce.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, that we'll lose jobs and we'll all be idle. And it hasn't happened yet. Some of my colleagues in economics have, over the centuries, said that new tools would cause people to be unemployed. And it's not the tools that make them unemployed, it's rules like that you can't fire someone in a large company that make them unemployed. Robots are tools. There's a marvelous scene in Ibsen's, let's see now, which one is it? Not The Master Builder. The one about the shipyard magnate. What's his name? No, Enemy of the People, I think it is. No,
Oh,
that's,
yeah.
that's another one. Anyway, there's a scene, the theme in that, the sub-theme in that play is that the workers resist the installation of machines because that will result in lost work. And that's, people think this way. And it's not true. Yes, people, look, I've been to the Volvo factory outside of Gothenburg, and there's enormous robots tirelessly doing this all day, and a man with a clipboard and a white coat standing, examining dials, and no one else in the factory, not quite, but close. But those people go to other jobs. If that were not so, if better machines, a wheel is a machine, a shovel is a machine, they're all machines. If machines made us unemployed, most of us would be unemployed. Yes. We'd have 90% unemployment.
There is a trend going on. A century ago, we worked 6.5 hours a day, days a week. Then it was 6, then it was 5.5, then it was 5, then it was 4.5, whatever it is now. So we're not living at a lower standard of living today than we were a century ago, because despite the fact that we're only working 70 or 80% as many hours, we're living much better than we did. That trend will continue, and robots will accelerate it.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it may well be that in 50 years we're only working 2 or 3 days a week.
Sounds good to me.
But so I worry a bit that the whole focus on jobs is somewhat misplaced. What we should be worried about is quality of life, overall quality of life, which includes leisure time. If we can, I see that it's getting in. My classmate and friend, Larry Summers, says the cost of virtually every non-politically inflected product category has declined over the last 20 years. Cars, electronics, furniture, you name it. Anything that's not politically inflected, as he calls it, that is, things that are controlled, like housing and healthcare and food. These are going up. But if you just leave things to the market, the prices will come down, and it'll require less and less money to live, and we'll be able to have more and more leisure time. So that's a thought.
Razine.
Yes. On robotics, I think you'll get a good answer from a book that's going to come out in a few months by Fredrik Eriksson and Bjorn Weigel, precisely on this issue of modern inventions and what they mean for jobs, among other things. I think new inventions with old regulations might turn out to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So Klaus Schwab and lots of economists who worry about a so-called fourth industrial revolution leading to wholesale job killing, that might come about if these new ideas, instead of existing in open systems, are stifled by all sorts of regulation, and the system becomes closed. But if you have more competition, it does boil down to more competition, and competition opened up in areas where stifling regulation exists, particularly in services markets, where there is a lot of government provision, where often the government has a monopoly or a near monopoly of finance and provision. If you open up those areas, then the chances are, as history has shown, that these inventions will spread into innovations that will be employment rich.
Sure.
That I don't think is rocket science.
No, I don't think so either.
No questions. Can I?
Are there any other
I want to ask one question
Go ahead.
to you. But my last book was called The New Equality: Global Development from Robin Hood to Botswana, where I'm arguing exactly like you do, like it was a revolution in equality that made the modern world.
Yes. Oh, good.
But it's institutional equality. And so I'm going with the Asamoah Robinson, Douglas North thing, arguing that there were institutional changes in England and in the Netherlands that laid the ground for this.
I don't think so.
Can you make a case against it? I haven't read your book yet, so I'm not.
Well, you know, you've got the whole summer to do it. I don't know why I haven't started. Over out in the countryside in your red shack, you can do it. I don't think so. My understanding of say the period from 1600. Well, let's do a full Douglas North. Let's start with 1688 or start with 1685 and go forward. My claim is that down to 1832, there are essentially no institutional inventions in Britain. None at all. The common law, the law of property, contracts, whatever you can name, don't change. The educational system doesn't change. The name an institution, the church doesn't change. Nothing changes. That's including the glorious revolution itself. Asamoah Robinson, Doug North, all my friends who are new institutionalists, Avner Greif, as I argue in the books, are probably wrong. It's not institutions. Look, most institutions are extremely conservative. The universities in England in the 18th century, as Adam Smith eloquently said, were terrible conservative institutions for the employment of the fellows of the colleges. So no, I don't think so. I think the institutions start changing rapidly in England, at least, after 1832.
Doug North talks about informal institutions and formal institutions, and you seem to focus on the formal part.
Yeah,
but
but look-
aren't the informal institutions pretty much the same as your ideas?
Yeah, but then he should call them ideas instead of informal institutions. Look, if you, here's what Doug does or did, and he was a splendid man and a marvelous scholar, but by the way, he didn't get the Nobel Prize for neo-institutionalism. How do I know? I wrote the citation. So let's get that aside. But in any case,
On that point,
yeah,
maybe the difference between the two perspectives is the institutional perspective is essentially static.
yes, that's exactly
and
right.
And the ideas perspective is essentially dynamic.
I completely agree.
Because it's the ideas that are driving the changes and evolution of the institutions.
That's right. That's right. It's ideas. It's ethical change. It's the habits of the lip. It's ideology. We can use my childhood Marxism. It's that those are where the change happens. And if you want to call them informal institutions, and wave at them the way Doug did, and say, well, it's informal institutions. Avner Greif does the same thing. Then you've just made a tautology. Mine is very specific, particular ideas that the origin of which I talk about. I'm not saying I'm the only person who has any thoughts on these matters, but I do believe that neo-institutionalism is misleading. In the case of the World Bank, it's become orthodoxy. And the orthodoxy at the World Bank now is add institutions and stir.
Okay, there's one last question there, probably. Oh, there's.
Let's
Okay,
go a
hello.
little further. There are a couple more. I'll be more brief.
All right. Thank you for discussing these subjects. It's very
Yeah.
interesting. I've been thinking a bit about them. I don't really know how to formulate my question, but I'm finding it very interesting. The digital era we live in now, how that affect productivity and
Here's the
and I've lived in the emerging market or the frontier market in Africa for a while, and I see what happened in Kenya the last
Sure.
couple of years, and corruption is of course a major issue there, but they have something called M-Pesa, which is a digital payment system. Just by your phone, you don't even have to have your own smartphone. You can have an old phone there. I'm thinking about how to create jobs for nations like Kenya with your digital idea of productivity, and do you have any ideas about this? How will I heard very positive ideas about the next 50 and 100 years from now. Everything will bloom and be very positive thanks to productivity shift upwards thanks to the new technology. But what do you foresee in the future?
Well, one of the things that gives me optimism is the fact that learning is becoming so broadly distributed and readily accessible, learning of technical skills around the world. And I'm referring to all the new online services as one example of many of which are free of charge. You see them, edX and MITx from Harvard and MIT, Coursera, Udacity, Code Academy, which teaches programming skills to anyone. It used to require tens of thousands of dollars and being accepted to an institution of higher learning in order to get the opportunity for education. Now all it takes is initiative and hard work. Those are not going to go away. But for those who are willing to invest the initiative and hard work, even in Kenya, even in Mongolia, we see kids taking the engineering courses that MIT offers online. Some of them are being accepted to MIT. And there's kind of an inversion happening. It used to be you applied to a higher university and then you you know, the university found out how well you did. Now, you do the work in advance, or increasingly in the future, it will be you demonstrate that you can do the work by taking the online courses, and for the ones who perform the best, those are the ones who are invited to go to the residential university, the elite university. So anyway, I'm for those who are willing to work hard and apply themselves and you know, have passion and perseverance about what they're doing, which is incidentally the title of the first chapter of my book, Passion and Perseverance, a Positive Feedback Loop. Those folks will have more opportunities than they have in the past.
Now we're talking about mostly.
Hold it closer, dear. We won't be able to hear you.
Okay, we're talking about capitalism without capitalist and more equal entrepreneurship. But can it really become a reality? Because whenever the entrepreneurship is driving a society for growth, there is always profit is there. So how is it that is, if you are keeping the government aside, so how are we going to handle that situation? And like, for example, Singapore, the government is involved in everything, most of the things.
Yeah, but you know, there's entry, which is the real protection for ordinary people. And it's the source of employment and look. Bill Nordhaus, an economist at Harvard, did a study of the percentage of the social gain that comes from an innovation that's retained by the inventor, and it turns out to be 2%. 98% ends up in the hands of consumers or wage earners. It's not the case that once there's an innovation, they just get richer and richer. It's not true that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Global inequality has been falling like a stone in the last 30 years.
That's an perfect end note, I think. So really, really give a round of applause.